Have you ever loved someone so much you were willing to become a monster to save them? To what lengths would you go to protect your child? Not from a stranger, but from the very people who vowed to love and cherish them. That's a question I never thought I'd have to answer, not at 70 years old. I thought my days of fighting were long behind me, left in the dust of a life already lived. I was wrong. The biggest fight of my life was waiting for me in my own daughter's living room, and it was a war I intended to win, no matter the cost. Before we go on, tell me, where are you watching this from? Have you ever had to stand up to a bully, even when you were afraid? Your stories give us all strength. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel so we can continue to share stories of quiet strength and loud courage. Now, let my story begin. The smell was the first thing that hit me, not of rot or decay, but of something far more insidious, the smell of surrender. It was a mixture of stale coffee, day-old takeout, and the cloying scent of Sylvia's cheap lavender air freshener, an aroma that had never belonged in my daughter Laura's home. The house itself seemed to sag under the weight of its unwelcome occupants. Sunlight struggled through grimy windows, illuminating dust motes dancing in the heavy air. This wasn't the home I remembered, the one Laura had so lovingly decorated with bright colors and fresh flowers, the one that used to ring with her easy laughter. This was a mausoleum of a life half-lived, and my daughter was its ghost. I found her in the kitchen, staring into a chipped coffee mug as if it held the answers to the universe. At 35, Laura had always been a vibrant force, her face a map of her emotions. Now, it was a blank page. Her shoulders were slumped, her eyes vacant and rimmed with a faint, bruised purple from sleepless nights. She was wearing a faded gray sweatshirt with a stain on the sleeve, a garment I knew she would have thrown out a year ago. She didn't seem to notice I was there until I gently placed my hand on her shoulder. She flinched, a sharp, bird-like movement, and a wave of cold fury washed over me. My daughter, my brave and beautiful girl, was flinching in her own home. "Mom," she whispered, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. "I didn't hear you come in." "The door was unlocked," I said, keeping my own voice even, a placid lake on the surface of a churning volcano. Behind her, on the counter, sat a pile of bills, red-lettered and urgent-looking. They were addressed to Ben, her husband, but they were her burden to carry. I knew without asking. That's when they came in. Sylvia, my daughter's mother-in-law, swept into the room like a carrion crow, her eyes, small and sharp, immediately fixing on me. She was a woman who fed on the misery of others, and she had been feasting well. Behind her slouched her son, Gary, Ben's older brother. He was a mountain of a man with a perpetually smug look, a man who had never worked a day in his life and saw it as his birthright to be cared for. "Martha," Sylvia chirped, her voice dripping with false sweetness. What a surprise. We were just about to sit down for lunch. Laura was just about to make us something. She didn't look at Laura. She spoke as if my daughter were a piece of furniture, a household appliance designed for her convenience. Laura's spine stiffened, but she didn't speak. She just moved to the refrigerator, her movements robotic. I saw it then, the unspoken plea in her eyes as she glanced at me for a fraction of a second. It was a silent scream, a desperate, drowning prayer. It said, "Help me. I'm disappearing." Gary grunted and dropped himself into a kitchen chair, which groaned in protest. He picked up one of the bills from the counter, glanced at it, and tossed it back down with a sneer. "Looks like little Benny's business isn't doing so hot. Good thing he has us to help manage things around here." The condescension was a physical blow. Ben's small, contracting business was his pride and joy, a dream he and Laura had built together. To hear it dismissed so callously in their own home was an act of profound cruelty. and Ben wasn't even here to defend it. He was out working, trying to keep them all afloat while his family bled him dry. Not just of money, but of his spirit, of his loyalty to his own wife. I looked from Sylvia's triumphant smirk to Gary's lazy arrogance, and then back to my daughter, who was pulling out lunch meat with trembling hands. I saw the fine lines of stress etched around her mouth, the way she made herself smaller, trying to take up less space in her own kitchen. And in that moment, a cold, hard clarity settled over me. Grief was a luxury I couldn't afford. Sadness was a weakness I had to discard. I was 70 years old. My hands were gnarled with arthritis, and my heart had a few miles on it. But I was a mother, and the love a mother has for her child is the most ancient and ruthless magic of all. They had mistaken my age for frailty. They had mistaken Laura's kindness for weakness. They had underestimated me. It would be the last mistake they ever made. I looked at the chipped mug in my daughter's hands, a small symbol of her broken life, and I made a silent vow. I would not just fix the cracks. I would give her a new cup, a new kitchen, a new life, and I would do it by shattering the chains her in-laws had wrapped around her soul, even if I had to burn their world to the ground to do it. It hadn't happened overnight. The slow creep of these vipers into my daughter's life was a masterclass in manipulation, a death by 1,000 cuts. Looking back, I could see the pattern, the red flags I had dismissed as generational differences or simply poor manners. I remembered Laura's wedding day, 10 years ago. Ben was a good man, gentle and kind-hearted, but he'd always been a boat with too weak a rudder, easily swayed by the strong currents of his mother and brother. At the reception, Sylvia had made a toast, not to the happy couple, but to her darling Benny, reminding him never to forget the family who raised him. It felt odd then. Now it felt like a declaration of ownership. The first few years were manageable. Sylvia and Gary lived a town over. Their visits were occasional, their criticisms veiled in the guise of helpful advice. It started with Laura's cooking. "A little bland, dear. Ben is used to more spice," Sylvia would say, pushing her plate away after 2 bites. Then it was the way she kept house. "All this bright color is a bit frantic. Don't you think? A man needs a calm place to rest." They were small digs, tiny seeds of doubt planted in Laura's mind, designed to make her question her own judgment, her own competence as a wife. When my first grandchild, Leo, was born, the visits became more frequent, the advice more like commands. Sylvia would snatch the crying baby from Laura's arms, declaring, "You're making him anxious. A baby can feel a mother's nerves." She criticized Laura's decision to breastfeed, then her decision to use formula. Nothing was ever right. Gary would chime in, his contributions always laced with a lazy sort of menace. "You gonna let her raise him to be a softie? Ben?" he'd boom, ruffling Leo's hair too roughly. Ben, caught in the middle, would just offer a weak smile. "They're just trying to help, honey," he'd say later, after they'd gone, leaving Laura weeping in frustration. He couldn't see the poison they were administering because he had been drinking it his whole life. To him, it was just the taste of home. I tried to talk to him once, years ago. I gently suggested that he and Laura needed to set boundaries, to be a united front. He had looked so uncomfortable, so torn. "They're my family. Martha," he'd said, as if that explained everything. It did, just not in the way he thought. It explained that his primary loyalty was still to them, not to the new family he had created. The real invasion began about a year ago. Gary had lost his job, a common occurrence, and Sylvia had claimed her house had black mold and was uninhabitable. It was a lie, of course. A convenient fiction to facilitate their move into Laura and Ben's spacious 4-bedroom house. They were supposed to stay for a few weeks. Those weeks bled into months. Their belongings began to appear, slowly at first, then all at once, colonizing every spare inch of the house. Sylvia's porcelain dolls with their dead eyes appeared on the mantelpiece. Gary's collection of greasy car magazines took over the coffee table. The guest room became their permanent suite, and soon, the entire house revolved around their needs, their schedules, their whims, their cruelty. Once veiled, became overt. They started calling Laura the landlady behind her back, but loud enough for her to hear. They would borrow money from Ben's wallet and never pay it back. Gary treated the home like a hotel, leaving his dirty clothes on the floor and expecting Laura to pick them up. Sylvia took over the kitchen completely, often forgetting to cook enough for Laura, who would end up eating a bowl of cereal for dinner after everyone else was finished. They chipped away at her, piece by piece, isolating her from Ben, who was working longer hours just to pay for the increased expenses. They created a narrative where Laura was incompetent, hysterical, and ungrateful, and they repeated it until Ben, exhausted and worn down, started to believe it. The chipped mug I saw in her hand during my last visit wasn't just a mug. It was a symbol of her entire existence, damaged, neglected, and used by everyone but the one who owned it. Recalling the years of escalating torment, the slow, methodical erosion of my daughter's spirit, I felt the last vestiges of any compassion for Sylvia and Gary burn away, leaving only the cold, hard ash of resolve. The moment that transformed my grief into an unbreakable resolve for justice came on a gray Tuesday afternoon. It wasn't a grand explosion, but a small, quiet act of cruelty that ripped through me with the force of a physical blow. I had come over on the pretense of dropping off some homemade jam, my way of checking in without making it seem like an inspection. The house was quiet when I let myself in. Ben's truck was gone, but I could hear the low murmur of the television from the living room. As I rounded the corner, I stopped, hidden by the archway, my breath catching in my throat. Laura was on her hands and knees, scrubbing a small, barely visible scuff mark on the hardwood floor. My grandchildren, 7-year-old Leo and 5-year-old Maya, were sitting on the couch, watching cartoons, lounging in the main armchair, the one Ben had bought for Laura on their anniversary. Was Sylvia. She held a cup of tea, her little finger extended in a parody of elegance, and watched my daughter with an expression of profound disgust. "Honestly, Laura," Sylvia said, her voice loud enough to carry over the sound of the cartoon, "I don't know how you can stand to live in such filth. That mark has been there since this morning. What do you even do all day?" Laura didn't look up. Her shoulders were tense, her movements jerky. "I'm sorry, Sylvia. I was busy with the laundry and—" "Excuses. Excuses." Sylvia cut her off. She took a loud sip of her tea. Then she looked directly at my grandchildren. "You see, children, this is what happens when you don't marry well. Your poor father has to work himself to the bone to support a woman who can't even keep a simple house clean." My blood ran cold. To poison my daughter's mind was one thing. To do it in her own home was another. But to use her own children as weapons against her, that was an unforgivable sin. Leo's face was a mask of confusion, his eyes darting from his grandmother to his mother. But it was Maya who broke my heart. Her lower lip began to tremble, and she looked at her mother, on the floor, with eyes full of a dawning shame. Sylvia was teaching my grandchildren to be ashamed of their own mother. Laura finally looked up, her face pale, her eyes pleading. "Sylvia, please, not in front of them." "Oh, don't be so dramatic." Sylvia scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. It's time they learned a thing or two about the real world. That was it. That was the final indignity. I felt something snap inside me, a cord of patience and civility that had been stretched to its breaking point for years. The jam jars in my bag felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds. I backed away slowly, my movements silent, my heart hammering against my ribs, not with fear, but with a cold, clear rage. I slipped out the front door, the quiet click of the latch drowned out by the sound of the television. I sat in my car for a long time, the engine off and my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I watched the house, my daughter's prison, and I thought of her on her hands and knees, being mocked in front of her children. The image was burned into my mind. The sadness I had felt for her, the helpless grief, began to curdle and harden. It transformed, transmuting from a soft, aching sorrow into something sharp and hard and focused. It was the birth of a plan. No more gentle talks with Ben. No more hoping things would get better. Hope was a passive bystander. I was done being passive. I was going to become an active, avenging force. They had drawn a battle line, and they had just crossed it with an act of unforgivable cruelty. I drove away from that curb not as a concerned mother, but as a soldier heading to war. I didn't know all the steps yet, but I knew the destination. Sylvia and Gary out, Laura's life back, and Ben forced to finally see the truth. A promise was forged in the silence of my car, a promise born of a mother's rage. I would not fail. My first move wasn't driven by emotion, but by a cold, hard pragmatism that surprised even me. Rage was the fuel, but strategy would be the engine. I needed a weapon, something more powerful than angry words or futile confrontations. I needed leverage. I needed the law. My mind went back years to when Laura and Ben were first buying the house. I remembered a conversation, a detail that seemed insignificant at the time. Ben's credit was a mess after a failed business venture before he met Laura, my late husband. God rest his soul, and I had given Laura the down payment as a gift, with one strict condition. The memory sent me to the dusty file cabinet in my study. After an hour of sifting through old papers, I found it, my copy of the closing documents for their house. My eyes scanned the pages, my heart beginning to beat a little faster, and then I saw it, clear as day on the title deed. Owner, Laura Jennings, a married woman as her sole and separate property. It all came rushing back. The mortgage broker had been adamant. With Ben's credit, the only way the bank would approve the loan was if the house and the mortgage were solely in Laura's name, using her pristine credit history and our gifted down payment. Ben had agreed, of course, eager to give his new wife a home. Over the years, I'm sure they'd both forgotten. They spoke of it as our house. Ben made the mortgage payments from his business account. In their minds, it was a shared asset. But on paper, in the eyes of the state of Oregon, it was not. The house belonged to Laura. Only Laura. Sylvia and Gary were living under the arrogant assumption that they were in their son and brother's home. They believed they had a right to be there, a familial claim. They were wrong. They were squatters in my daughter's house, and they didn't even know it. The next morning, I made an appointment with Arthur Vance, an old lawyer in town who had handled my husband's will. Arthur was semi-retired, sharp as a tack, and had a reputation for being a bulldog who delighted in property disputes. I sat in his musty office, the air thick with the smell of old books and brewing coffee, and laid out the entire story. I didn't soften the edges. I told him about the verbal abuse, the financial drain, the colonization of the house, and the final soul-crushing incident with the children. He listened patiently, his fingers steepled, his gaze never leaving my face. When I finished, I pushed the copy of the deed across his desk. He put on his reading glasses and studied it for a long moment. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile that did not touch his eyes. His eyes were all business. "Well, Martha," he said, his voice a low rumble, "this is what we call a slam dunk. Sylvia and Gary are, legally speaking, tenants at will with no lease agreement, which means they have absolutely no legal right to be on that property if the sole owner, your daughter, asks them to leave." The relief was so profound it almost made me dizzy. "So she can just kick them out?" "With proper notice, yes," Arthur confirmed. "We'll need to serve them with a formal written notice to vacate. We'll give them 30 days, as is standard. If they refuse to leave by that date, we can begin eviction proceedings. But my guess is they won't let it get that far. People like this, they're bullies, and bullies are cowards when confronted with real authority." He leaned back in his chair. "The key here is Ben. He has no legal say in who lives in that house, but he has an emotional hold on your daughter. Sylvia and Gary will use him to fight back. Laura needs to be prepared for that." I nodded, my resolve hardening further. She will be, and I'll be right there with her. I left Arthur's office clutching the deed like a holy scripture. It was more than just paper. It was power. It was the secret weapon they never saw coming, the foundation upon which I would build my daughter's liberation. I had found the crack in their fortress, and I was about to drive a wedge into it so deep it would shatter their entire world. The smug confidence of Sylvia and Gary was built on a lie they had told themselves for so long they believed it was true. I was about to introduce them to the one thing they couldn't bully, manipulate, or ignore: the truth. Armed with the knowledge of the deed, my next step was to understand the full scope of my enemy's intentions. It wasn't enough to know they were cruel. I needed to know their endgame. Arthur's warning about them using Ben echoed in my mind. I had to see for myself just how deep their influence ran and what their ultimate plan was. I needed to become a ghost, a whisper in the walls of the home they had stolen. My chance came 2 days later. Laura called me, her voice strained, to ask if I could watch the kids. Ben had secured a big out-of-town job that would take a few days, and she wanted to take the children to visit a cousin on the coast, to get them out of that toxic house for a weekend. It was the first spark of her old self I'd seen in months. "Of course, darling," I said, my mind already racing. "But why don't you let them stay with me? You go to the coast, alone. Have a real break. You deserve it." She hesitated, guilt warring with exhaustion in her voice. But I insisted. After she dropped off a tearfully grateful Leo and Maya, I waited. I knew Laura's car and her routines. I also knew that with Ben gone and Laura and the kids supposedly away, Sylvia and Gary would be at their most unguarded. That evening, under the cloak of a moonless, overcast Oregon sky. I drove to Laura's neighborhood. I parked my car 2 blocks away and walked, my heart a quiet drum against my ribs. I still had the spare key Laura had given me years ago, the one she'd probably forgotten about. The house was dark except for the flickering blue light of the television in the living room. I crept around to the back, my rubber-soled shoes silent on the damp grass. The kitchen window was cracked open an inch to let out the smell of whatever greasy dinner Gary had cooked. Their voices carried clearly on the still night air. I crouched beneath the window, hidden by a large rhododendron bush, the damp leaves cold against my cheek. I felt like a spy in a foreign land, and in a way, he's too soft on her, I tell you. Sylvia's sharp voice cut through the air. All this Laura's feelings nonsense. It's his house, his money. He needs to man up. He's getting there. Gary's lazy drawl responded. I could picture him slouched at the table, picking his teeth. This out-of-town job is a big one. He said the payout should be enough to finally clear his business debts. There was a pause. Then Sylvia spoke, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "It's more than enough. I saw the contract he left on the desk. Once that money is in his account, that's when you need to talk to him again. The housing market in this town is insane. They could sell this place for a fortune." "And do what?" Gary asked. "And buy something more practical," Sylvia snapped, her voice full of false reason. "A smaller place for them and the kids. And with the rest of the money, Ben can invest in a real business. With us, you and him, a partnership. We can guide him, make sure he doesn't squander it on frivolous things. Frivolous things. Like his wife and children. My blood turned to ice. It was all there. Their plan wasn't just to live off of them. It was to strip them of their largest asset, to convince Ben to sell his wife's home out from under her, sever his financial independence, and tether him to them forever. They weren't just parasites. They were predators preparing to devour the host. They saw Laura not as a daughter-in-law, but as an obstacle to their financial security. I stayed crouched in the dark, listening, for another hour. They talked about their debts, about how much they deserved this, how Ben owed them for all the sacrifices they'd made. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of it was staggering. When I finally crept away, back to the safety of my car, the cold night air felt warm compared to the chill in my soul. I had what I needed. It was no longer just a suspicion or an assumption. It was a fact, overheard from their own vile mouths. Their villainy was absolute, and my response would be, too. The letter Arthur Vance was drafting was no longer just a legal notice. It was the first tremor of an earthquake I was about to trigger. The first strike wasn't a battering ram. It was a whisper. A carefully folded piece of paper delivered by a certified mail carrier, a formal, impersonal harbinger of the storm to come. Arthur Vance had drafted it beautifully. It was a masterpiece of legal restraint, devoid of any emotion, which made it all the more terrifying. It simply stated, on his official letterhead, that per the request of the legal property owner, they, Sylvia Jennings and Gary Jennings, were required to vacate the premises at 124 Willow Creek Lane within 30 days of receipt. It named Laura as the owner. It gave a final date. It mentioned no names other than theirs and Laura's. Ben was not mentioned. I was not mentioned. It was a cold, hard, legal document that came from nowhere and implicated only one person. I had lunch with Laura the day before it was scheduled to arrive. I didn't tell her it was coming. It was a calculated risk. I needed her to have plausible deniability. When the bomb dropped, I wanted her reaction to be one of genuine shock, not of a co-conspirator. I needed Sylvia and Gary to believe this was Laura's doing alone, a sudden and inexplicable act of rebellion. It would sow confusion and discord, making them question their control over her. I had a wonderful time at the coast. Mom, she'd told me over salad, a faint touch of color back in her cheeks. It was so quiet I could actually hear myself think. "You should do it more often," I said, my heart aching with the secret I was keeping. "You need to take care of yourself, honey." The letter arrived on a Thursday morning. I know because I received a delivery confirmation from the post office at 10:15 a.m. I spent the rest of the day in a state of high alert, my phone clutched in my hand, waiting for the fallout. The call came at 4:30 p.m. It wasn't Laura, it was Ben. His voice was a frantic, bewildered mess. "Martha, what the hell is going on? My mom is hysterical. She said Laura is trying to evict her from her own son's house." I played my part. "What, Ben, slow down, I don't understand. What are you talking about?" He explained, his words tumbling over one another. About the lawyer letter. About Laura's name being on it as the sole owner. He was utterly baffled. The detail about the house ownership, a fact he had once known but long since buried under years of shared life, had clearly blindsided him completely. "That can't be right," he stammered. "It's our house. I don't know anything about a letter." "Ben," I said, my voice laced with carefully crafted concern. "But the house. Honey, don't you remember when you bought it? Your credit was still recovering. The only way the bank would approve the loan was to put it solely in Laura's name. It was just a formality at the time, to get you the home you both wanted." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head, the dawning, horrifying realization he had forgotten. In his mind, his hard work and mortgage payments had made the house his. He had never considered the legal reality. I have to go," he finally mumbled, and hung up. The first tremor had hit. The smug facade of the unwelcome house guests had been cracked. For the first time, a seed of paranoia, of fear, was planted in their minds. They had been living in a fortress of their own arrogance, believing they held all the power. But the letter, arriving with the cold authority of the law, told them otherwise. It told them their power was an illusion. It would force them to turn to Ben, but Ben was now armed with a confusing, half-remembered truth. They would pressure him, rage at him, but for the first time, he wouldn't have a simple answer. The ground beneath their feet, which they thought was solid rock, was starting to feel like sand. This was just the beginning. I had rattled their cage. Soon, I was going to open it. The 2 weeks following the letter's arrival were a brutal war of attrition. Just as I'd predicted, Sylvia and Gary directed their full, venomous force at Ben, who, in turn, transmitted that pressure directly to Laura. The house became a pressure cooker of whispered accusations and tearful, late-night arguments that I only heard about through Laura's strained and exhausted phone calls. "He doesn't understand. Mom," she sobbed to me one evening. "He keeps saying I've betrayed his family. Sylvia told him I've been plotting this for years, that you put me up to it to steal the house from him." "What did you tell him?" I asked, keeping my voice calm and steady, an anchor in her storm. "I told him I didn't know anything about a letter, and I don't, but they don't believe me. Gary cornered me in the hallway and told me I was a conniving snake. Ben just stood there and let him." This was the hardest part. Watching my daughter suffer through the fallout of an attack I had launched, but it was a necessary pain, the lancing of a wound to let the poison out. They were revealing their true selves, their absolute tyranny. In a way, Ben could no longer ignore. He was seeing their behavior, unfiltered, now that they were scared. "Laura, listen to me," I said, my voice firm. "You are the owner of that house. You are the mother of those children. You are not a guest, and you are not their servant. You have done nothing wrong. Do not apologize. Do not back down." I decided it was time to move to the next phase. Laura couldn't fight this alone. She needed to feel her power, not just hear about it. I picked her up the next morning and drove her to Arthur Vance's office. I introduced them, and then I let him take over. I watched as he gently but firmly walked her through the legal reality. He showed her the deed. He explained her rights. He validated her feelings, telling her stories of other clients in similar situations. "Laura," he said finally, his gaze kind but direct, "what your in-laws are doing is a classic case of financial and emotional abuse. The law is on your side, but you have to be the one to decide to use it. Martha can't do it for you. I can't do it for you." I saw the shift in her then, sitting in that quiet, dignified office, away from the chaos of her home, hearing a respected professional confirm that she wasn't crazy, wasn't ungrateful, wasn't a villain. It was like watching a flower turn toward the sun. Her spine straightened, the vacillation in her eyes sharpened into focus. "What do we do next?" she asked, her voice quiet but clear. That was all I needed to hear. The final piece of the plan involved a visit to the local police department. I went alone. I spoke with a sergeant, a calm, middle-aged woman named Davis, who listened with a patient and practiced ear as I explained the situation. I didn't embellish. I stated the facts: a volatile domestic situation, an impending eviction date, and my concern that the occupants might refuse to leave peacefully or could become aggressive. I showed her a copy of the deed and the notice to vacate. "So you're not asking us to evict them," Sergeant Davis clarified. "You're requesting a civil standby on the date of eviction to ensure there's no breach of the peace." "Exactly," I confirmed. "I want officers present when my daughter officially asks them to leave the property at the end of the notice period. I want to prevent any possibility of intimidation or violence." She nodded, making a note. "That's wise. We can do that. Just give us a call that day, and we'll dispatch a car." I left the station feeling a profound sense of gravity. All the pieces were in place. The legal groundwork was laid. The police were briefed. And most importantly, Laura's spirit, though bruised, was bolstered. The 30-day deadline on the notice was now just 4 days away. That night, I sat in my quiet house, the original deed resting on the table in front of me. I ran my fingers over Laura's name, printed in crisp, black ink. It was her name, her house, her life. I had become a strategist, a conspirator, a warrior. I was a 70-year-old woman preparing for a battle on my daughter's front porch. I clutched the deed in my hand, not as a weapon of attack, but as a shield of truth. The final act was coming, and I was ready. The day arrived crisp and clear, a beautiful autumn morning that was utterly at odds with the ugliness of the task ahead. The 30-day notice period had expired at midnight. I picked up Laura at 8:30 a.m. from a nearby coffee shop where she had been waiting, her face pale but resolute. We didn't speak much on the short drive to her house. There was nothing left to say. All the planning and preparation had led to this single moment. As promised, I called the police non-emergency line, and Sergeant Davis assured me a car was on its way. We parked down the street and waited. 5 minutes later, a patrol car pulled up in front of Laura's home. 2 officers got out, a man and a woman, both with calm, professional demeanors. This was our cue. Laura and I got out of my car and walked towards the house, the officers meeting us on the public sidewalk. I introduced myself and Laura and quickly explained the situation again. "We're here to ask the 2 non-resident occupants to leave. We just want to ensure things remain peaceful." The female officer, Officer Riley, nodded. "We'll stand by. This is a civil matter, so we can't force them out, but we can be present to prevent any escalation." With our uniformed escort, we walked up the pathway. Every step felt momentous. I glanced at Laura. She was clutching her purse, her knuckles white, but her chin was high. She was terrified, but she was doing it anyway. That was the definition of courage. I rang the doorbell. It took a moment, and then the door was wrenched open. Gary stood there, shirtless, a look of sleepy confusion on his face that quickly curdled into a hostile sneer when he saw the police officers standing behind me. "What is this?" he growled. Before I could answer, Sylvia bustled into view, her face a mask of theatrical outrage. "Police? Have you gone mad? Laura, calling the police on your own family." It was my moment. I stepped forward, my voice leaving no room for argument. It was louder and firmer than I had heard it in years. "She is not calling the police on her family. She is ensuring a peaceful transition of her property. Your notice to vacate expired this morning. It is time for you to leave." Sylvia let out a derisive laugh. "This is ridiculous. This is my son's house. Ben, get out here." Ben appeared from the hallway, looking like he'd just woken up. His eyes widened at the sight of the police, then darted to Laura, then to me. His face was a canvas of confusion and betrayal. "Laura, Mom, what's happening?" "Tell them, Ben!" Sylvia shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "Tell this old witch that this is your house and we're not going anywhere." All eyes fell on Ben. He was the linchpin. His next words would determine everything. He looked at his mother, his face racked with a lifetime of conditioned loyalty. He looked at his wife, her eyes pleading with him to finally, for once, stand with her. He hesitated. "Well, it's our house." That's when I played my final card. I reached into my purse and pulled out the original deed. I didn't hand it to him. I held it up for him to see, my thumb holding it open to the signature page. "No, Ben, it is not," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. "It is Laura's house. It has always been Laura's house. Legally, exclusively. You know this is true. You were there when you both decided this was the only way to secure the loan." He stared at the document, the truth of it hitting him with the force of a physical blow. His face went slack with the shock of a memory unearthed. He remembered. Sylvia and Gary stared, dumbfounded. They had built their entire campaign of terror on the belief that Ben held the power. They were so stunned, so utterly floored by this undeniable black and white proof that they were speechless. The foundation of their world had just crumbled into dust. Laura finally spoke, her voice shaking but strong. "I want you out of my house. Now." Gary took a step forward, his fists clenching. "You can't do this." The male officer, Officer Evans, shifted his weight, his hand resting casually on his belt. "Sir, I suggest you and your mother start packing your things. The home owner has asked you to leave. If you refuse, it becomes a trespassing issue." The fight went out of them in an instant. The sight of the uniform, the cold, hard language of the law, and the irrefutable deed, it was a combination they couldn't bully. Their power had evaporated on that sunny porch. Defeated. Sylvia shot Laura a look of pure hatred, a look I would never forget, before turning and stalking back into the house. Gary followed, his swagger gone, replaced by the slumped shoulders of a coward who had been called out. The front door had opened on a confrontation, and in the end, it was their faces, stunned, defeated, and utterly powerless, that I would remember most. The law had come to call, and for once they had no choice but to answer. The silence after the storm was the most deafening sound I had ever heard. Officer Riley and Officer Evans stayed for another hour, a calm and imposing presence in the driveway, as Sylvia and Gary frantically and sloppily threw their belongings into suitcases and cardboard boxes. They didn't speak another word to Laura or me. They moved with a bitter, resentful energy, slamming doors and drawers. Gary made several trips to his beat-up truck, tossing his things in the back with angry grunts. Sylvia emerged last, carrying a box of her porcelain dolls, her face pinched and gray. She refused to look at any of us as she climbed into the passenger seat. As they drove away, she finally turned and gave Laura one last glare, a silent curse that hung in the air long after their truck had rounded the corner. And then there was quiet. The officers gave us a nod. "Looks like everything is resolved. Give us a call if there are any other issues," Officer Riley said. And then they were gone too. It was just the three of us left on the front lawn. Me, Laura, and Ben. Ben stood frozen, watching the empty space where his mother's truck had been. He looked like a man who had just witnessed a car crash in slow motion, unable to process the wreckage around him. Laura, for her part, simply walked past him, through the open front door, and into her home. I followed her. The house already felt different. lighter. The oppressive weight of Sylvia's presence was gone. The cheap lavender scent was already fading, replaced by the clean scent of the autumn air coming through the door. Laura walked through the living room, her fingers tracing the back of the couch. She went into the kitchen and stood there, just breathing. Ben finally came inside, closing the door softly behind him. He looked at Laura, his face a mess of shame, anger, and confusion. "You couldn't have just talked to me?" he asked, his voice cracking. "You had to humiliate them. Humiliate me. With the police." Laura turned to face him, and the woman who looked at him was not the ghost I had seen in this kitchen weeks ago. There was fire in her eyes, a lifetime of suppressed pain and frustration finally unleashed. "Talk to you. Ben?" she said, her voice dangerously low. "I have been talking to you for years. I have been begging you, crying to you, pleading with you to see what they were doing to me, to us, to our family. Every time I tried, you told me I was exaggerating. You told me they were just trying to help. You chose them. Over and over and over again, you chose them." She took a step closer to him. "Today wasn't about humiliating anyone. Today was about me refusing to be a victim in my own home any longer. I didn't call the police to shame you. I called them because I was afraid of what your brother might do when I finally stood up for myself. And you know what, Ben? Standing there in the hallway while he called me a snake, you proved my fears were justified. You did nothing." Every word was the truth, and every word was a hammer blow to the fragile reality Ben had constructed for himself. He had no defense. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There was nothing to say. He had failed her, completely and utterly. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this, Ben," Laura said, her voice softening now with a deep, aching sadness. "Not for what they did, but for what you didn't do. For letting it happen." She walked past him and went upstairs. I heard the bedroom door click shut. Ben sank into a kitchen chair, the same one Gary had occupied so arrogantly just weeks before, and put his head in his hands. He didn't cry. He just sat there, broken, in the deafening silence of a reclaimed house. This was his reckoning. His malevolent family was gone. But the damage they had left in their wake was immense. He had to face the man he had become, or failed to become. He had to finally choose, not between them and her, because they were gone, but between the man he was and the man his wife and children deserved. The house was quiet, but the hardest work, the work of rebuilding a marriage shattered by betrayal, was just beginning. The weeks that followed were tender and raw, like new skin forming over a burn. There was no magic fix. Ben didn't have a single grand epiphany that washed away years of weakness. Instead, he began a slow, painful process of atonement. He slept on the couch for the first week, giving Laura the space she had so desperately needed. He started coming home from work on time. He began to see the house through her eyes, noticing the small acts of vandalism his family had committed, the cigarette burn on the armchair, the scratch on the hardwood floor, and he fixed them, quietly, without being asked. He started talking. More importantly, he started listening. They began seeing a marriage counselor, a neutral third party who could help them navigate the minefield of their shared history. In those sessions, Ben finally admitted the truth he had avoided for so long. He had been a coward, terrified of his mother's disapproval and his brother's scorn, and he had sacrificed his wife's happiness to avoid their wrath. It was an ugly admission, but it was a necessary one. My role shifted from warrior back to mother, to grandmother. I was there not to direct, but to support. I helped Laura cleanse the house, literally and spiritually. We packed up every last trace of Sylvia and Gary, a forgotten sweater, a half-used bottle of shampoo, and donated it all to charity. We opened the windows, letting the crisp autumn air chase out the last of the stale energy. We bought new flowers, bright yellow chrysanthemums, and placed them in the center of the kitchen table. One Saturday afternoon, about a month after the eviction, I came over to find the house filled with the smell of baking bread and the sound of laughter. Leo and Maya were at the kitchen table, their hands covered in flour, helping Laura knead dough. Ben was there too, leaning against the counter, just watching them. He wasn't interfering or directing. He was just present, his eyes full of a quiet, wondering love for the family he had almost lost. Laura caught my eye and smiled. A real smile. It reached her eyes, crinkling the corners in that way I hadn't seen in years. Later, after the kids were in bed, she and I sat on the porch swing, wrapped in blankets against the evening chill. "He's trying, Mom," she said softly, looking out at the quiet street. "He really is. It's not perfect, but it's better." "I see that," I said. She was quiet for a moment, then she rested her head on my shoulder. "Thank you for showing me how to be strong, for reminding me who I was." I squeezed her hand. "You were always strong, honey. You just forgot for a little while." We sat in comfortable silence, watching the first stars appear in the deepening twilight. The chipped coffee mug was gone, replaced by a new set Laura had bought. The house felt like a home again, not just a structure, but a sanctuary. It was a testament to the fact that sometimes you have to tear everything down to rebuild it stronger. Justice had been served, not in a courtroom, but on a front porch, and peace had been found, not in the absence of conflict, but in the courage to face it. Watching the genuine, unburdened laughter return to my daughter's eyes was my victory. It was the only one that ever mattered. Her happiness, reclaimed one sunrise at a time, was proof of the fierce, unyielding, and sometimes ruthless power of a mother's love. In the end, it's the quiet moments that tell you the war is truly over. It's the sound of your daughter humming in her own kitchen, the easy laughter of your grandchildren who no longer have to walk on eggshells, the comfortable silence between a husband and wife who are learning to trust each other again. The echoes of the battle fade, replaced by the gentle rhythm of a life reclaimed. I learned that strength isn't about the absence of fear. It's about acting in spite of it. At 70 years old, I had to become a force of nature my daughter's tormentors never saw coming. Not because I am a hateful person, but because my love for her is a non-negotiable truth. We are taught to be polite, to keep the peace, to turn the other cheek. But sometimes, peace is a luxury that comes at too high a cost. Sometimes, the most loving thing a person can do is to draw a line in the sand and declare, "No more." The real victory wasn't in watching Sylvia and Gary drive away defeated. It was in seeing Laura stand tall in her own doorway, the rightful queen of her own castle. Her journey back to herself is a long one, but she walks it with her head held high, knowing her own worth. And I am here, a proud witness to her resilience. I share this story not to glorify conflict, but to honor the strength it can reveal. Have you ever had to fight a battle that no one else could see? What does the word home mean to you? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. Your wisdom enriches us all. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing these tales of the quiet battles that shape our lives.